Well, thank you, Mark, and certainly I'm very honored to have the opportunity to stand before you. I'll be honest, Mark called and said, Scott, we'd like you to be part of this, and I got the perfect job for you. And the longer I sat here the last 2 days, the more daunting and challenging this task became. Because I completely agree with other speakers. It's been an awesome conference, and we've covered a lot of waterfront that's very diverse. And yet at the same time, I think there's some common themes that are intertwined as we kind of study these topics. We kind of covered 3 basic topics in terms of, we started out with crossbreeding, and we've talked about gene editing, and we've talked about carbon cycle and regenerative agriculture. And my job here this afternoon as we kind of conclude is maybe I don't know that I've got the answers in terms of where we go from here, but maybe some food for thought in terms of where we need to be thinking, and maybe a little context. As I sat in that chair, like you all are now, we're amongst a group of thought leaders, right? We're all leaders, whether you're an extension bee specialist like myself, you're in industry associated with the Breed Association, or a producer. By being here, you're a thought leader. And I think as we think about that, how do we carry away what we've heard the last 2 days in our roles as thought leaders, as people who interact with others in the industry, which weren't as fortunate to be here to hear all this stuff? How do we interact with them? How do we make a positive influence? And how do we make our industry better? Because these topics we talked about are here to stay. The panel we just had did an excellent job of kind of outlining that. And so what are the things to think about? With that, let's go to the first slide. So kind of my goal is to maybe from a 10,000 foot level, kind of, in my opinion, share with you kind of what I heard. And we started with Dr. Weber, and he did an awesome job in terms of kind of bringing to the forefront lots of the research and the application as it relates to crossbreeding and hybrid vigor. Much of that research has been available for some time. We've known the application, we've known the benefits of crossbreeding, we've known the benefits of hybrid vigor. We had a great industry panel which joined him of very diverse nature. From the King Ranch, Robert Hodgen, John Maddox, as well as Jim Moore, 3 extremely diverse producers that shared their philosophies and thoughts as it relates to breeding programs. And my takeaways, I guess, crossbreeding we know is a great tool. And Dr. Weber did an excellent job outlining that. What he characterized very nicely and put in modern terms as we think about it today is that advantage to crossbreeding as it relates to cow production systems today. My computer just died. Just turn around and look at it, Scott. So $290 per cow per year. That's significant. Of course, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Weber, that's maximum heterosis, right? And so as we think about that and apply it to optimizing heterosis, that's still a big number. Our panel did an excellent job reminding us that reproduction is king. Cows have got to have calves. They've got to be reproductively efficient, or it's simply not going to work, right? And we had that diverse panel. I think they outlined for us that breeding systems and selection systems need to match our environment, and they're going to be diverse as a result. So we've got to design cows that match our environment and mate them to produce a product that fits the marketplace. And that's diverse, whether you're from Virginia, you're from Oklahoma, you're from Texas, wherever that might be. So structured, well-designed crossbreeding systems that focus on the cow and capture maternal advantage. Next slide, please. Then I thought we had a very interesting, with Dr. Peel presented, some very interesting preliminary data. And I'm very anxious, for one, to learn more about this data, because I think it holds some key things that we can glean from that. Looking at the Clay Center data and looking at the impact of heterosis and the economic impact of that, okay? I think we know that, and Dr. Weber's estimates talked about the cow-calf sector, and I think we understand that the biggest impact there relative to heterosis is at the cow-calf sector, but it also appears that there's some impacts as we look at it down the supply chain at the carcass level, okay? And where I'm excited about is if we get this data, can it help us with decision tools that combine both additive and non-additive effects as it relates to genetic selection, okay? We haven't been able to do that real well to this point, but perhaps with this data and this simulation, we can do that. Next slide, please, Barry. We then moved into climate-related topics: sustainability, climate-smart agriculture, regenerative ranching, etc. And I thought Dr. Roundtree gave us an incredible talk that was very thought-provoking. As I sat in the stands and listened, I appreciated pretty quickly that this is an area that I need to get better up to speed up with in terms of the vocabulary, in terms of better understanding the entire process as it relates to our business. I thought there was several key components that Dr. Roundtree brought out, and those have been echoed as well by other panels. Number one, the beef supply chain is global, okay, and because of that complexity, and that's probably what's driving reporting of emissions is going to be inevitable as a result. Secondly, it's really up for debate, and it's a jump ball exactly how we're going to measure emissions. And he challenged us as an industry to get to the table and be part of that discussion and decision-making process so that how we measure it can benefit us in the beef industry. Dr. Roundtree showed us some data that said that the least expensive and most resilient approach to this was to adaptively manage our cows and understanding that it's not simply an efficiency measure, but rather a metric that focuses on production per unit of landscape or per acre, if you will, that's regenerated or a natural resource conserved. And lastly, I think the important point he made was the soil carbon or soil health improvements have a larger impact on life cycle assessment than does methane or any other greenhouse gas. And that's really what we need to focus on from a beef industry perspective as it provides the best light in terms of our emission footprint. Hugh from the Noble Research Institute followed him, and I thought put into practice and provided us some practical applications to regenerative ranching and give us several examples of things that we could do immediately to help us in this particular space. I think that's particularly useful for you producers that reside in this region, but also very important components, and I think a lot of overlap with the data that Dr. Roundtree shared us from Michigan. So some very practical applications that range from increased forage diversity, limited use of fertilizer and herbicides, stocking rate, big grazing herds, minimizing hay use, and those kind of things. He challenged us to monitor that, to adapt, and to manage. And he also showed us some data that it might require some initial investment up front to get involved in this and put this to practice, but in the long term would certainly pay. Next slide, Bray. Then we moved into gene editing, which Dr. Allison did a phenomenal job last night, taking a very complex topic and putting it in what I call cowboy terms, right? We could all understand that. She emphasized to us that gene editing is really just natural selection accelerated, right? We've been doing this through selection programs for a long, long time. We're not creating new DNA. The DNA that we consume or we're eating is not new, it's not different, okay, and so should not be of concern. Currently, it appears that we're harvesting the low-hanging fruit, application of gene editing related to pollness, health traits, heat tolerance, the slick gene, those kinds of things. Some discussion about where we're going with the more complex traits as opposed to the simply inherited traits. There's a lot of potential, and she shared with us several of those potential. Our panel was excellent. Dr. Faber shared with us kind of the evolution and adoption of technology, particularly on the reproductive side, and how that interacts with gene editing and the business model behind that. A lot of discussion about the regulatory process, which I think will dovetail into the next couple of slides. Dr. Tad and Dr. Beaver covered that at length. I think as we get through this and we think about gene editing, there's certainly questions as it relates to consumer acceptance. And we heard a lot of thoughts related to that from several of our panel speakers as it relates to how consumers accept this. Banks provided us some great examples in the swine industry in terms of how that's being utilized. And I think as we analyze and think about consumer acceptance, maybe it boils down to the spin that we put on it, the terminology that we use. What are we focusing on? If we focus on the value proposition as opposed to the process and maybe some of the negative connotations associated with other technologies, we might be better suited. We had a great panel. The Breed Association gentlemen talked about how gene editing can help us in making combination cattle and where we currently are relative to that particular technology. Bray? Which kind of leads me to my last slide and I guess my overarching thoughts. And Jack Ward did a great job kicking us off yesterday at noontime and provided the impetus to how we got here. And one of those points, in addition to crossbreeding and in addition to gene editing, was the question about who will own our data, genetics, and genotypes moving forward. As I evaluate that, and we think about what we've talked about the last 2 days, that still holds true. I think we can think about it in a little different context, though. If we think about who will own the data, if we think about climate-smart agriculture, and we think about measurement of emissions, who is going to have the say or who's going to establish the rules and regulations or the policy relative to how we measure some of these traits? Who is going to be at the table making those decisions as it relates to our industry and how our industry capitalizes on that, or what effect that has on our particular industry? So who's going to determine the metrics? Who, how, and what will we measure as it relates to climate? And what will be the economic impact of that? Okay? I'm convinced that we need to get to the table. We all need to get to the table. So one of my challenges, I think, as I'm going to take home is I need to get to the table with my thought leaders at home, with my producers, with my Cattlemen's Association and other groups. This is here to stay, folks. It's a global marketplace. We heard that from banks relative to swine. It's very much true in beef. And we need to get at the table and figure out and have a voice in where we're headed, much like we have with other technologies. Secondly, and this just came up kind of here at the end, but as it relates to intellectual property and gene editing, who's going to own that? What's the role of private companies and how they interact with breed associations and breeders and universities doing research, et cetera? I think that's an important question that I think again, as an industry that we're wrestling with. Here's one that came up that I think we could, that's maybe just a little more focused on the production side, but where are we from a mature cow size standpoint? Are we doing a good job as an industry measuring mature size? Do we have the tools to help us influence and genetically change mature size? And why do I bring that up as we think about the things that Dr. Roundtree talked about in terms of efficiency as it relates to climate. He talked about weaning weight percentage as a percentage of body weight and how that declines as cows get smaller. They're smaller footprint as it relates to climate as cows get smaller on a per acre basis. We heard from our panel on crossbreeding in terms of what their optimum cow size was and how that changed across environments. So I think there's merit in that. And I'd ask my breed association friends, how many mature weight records do we have? How comfortable are we with those? Are those adequate tools to help us in terms of moving forward as an industry? And the last one, and maybe the most important one in my mind, is how do we communicate our story? As we leave here today, how do we communicate with those that we influence, those we interact with, and those we work with, relative to sustainability, relative to the use of technology? What are the benefits and shared values? In simple terms, I think we got to get to the table. We got to get to the table as these things are discussed, as sustainability, as carbon footprint, as use of technology and gene editing. We've got to get to the table and discuss them and talk to people, whether that's the public, whether that's our colleagues, or whether that's fellow producers. We've got to take it upon ourselves to get to the table and talk about them. Because if we don't talk about them, other people are going to make the decisions for us. And we don't want that to happen. So I think it's paramount to our future. These are great tools. Gene editing is a great tool. It's important to our future success, which was well established here in our last panel. But we've got to get educated and informed about it. And as thought leaders, be engaged in the dialogue in the right way and using facts and not emotion. And leave you with a couple final thoughts. Jack opened our session and we talked about the 1988 conference, Mark. And Dr. Tadashek talked about the truth is most important. I think that echoes really loud right now. The truth is most important as it relates to things like gene editing, as it relates to things like climate impact. Okay? Our consumers and the public are not always getting the truth. It's our job to tell them the truth. And secondly, the future is decided by those of us that show up. We all showed up today and yesterday, all right? So we need to be at the table, help make the decisions, and interact with others to make the future of the beef industry very sustainable, positive, and continue to have the strongest beef supply and beef product in the world. With that, it's been an honor to be here, Mark. I want to take one more opportunity and thank Mark and thank the folks at Oklahoma State. If you all agree, let's give them another round of applause for a great job.
Folks, let's give Scott a round of applause. Very well done. That's a tough job. And I don't think I've said much about him the last couple days, but old Bray Haven, stuck up there in the sound booth, has managed to pull off all the IT work for the conference. Bray, thank you very much. He won't raise his hand.